So germ means new life or new growth. And if you study like developmental biology, you'll know that like the egg and the sperm are called germ cells. And that's where everything originates from. So calling a germ something that makes us sick is like an inversion of the meaning. And many things are like that in this materialist paradigm. And those things, like I learned over time, are kind of clues to look into something and see, what the truth is.
Today, I'm doing something totally different from my norm, and I have a special guest with me that I'm about to ask some really good questions of. I'm very excited. I am sitting here with Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and you may have heard of him or maybe not. He's kind of making the rounds lately on YouTube. And Dr. Kaufman is a medical physician that specializes in mental and emotional health as a psychiatrist. And he has a background in molecular biology from MIT, as well as some experience working with cancer patients and pediatrics, among other things. I believe he is very well qualified to look at the current paradigm that we're experiencing with COVID from the lens of both a physician and a psychiatrist, as well as somebody who is in the middle, I guess, of maybe leaving that paradigm or having a more personal awakening towards natural health and natural health solutions. And when this whole COVID pandemic began, when the first stay-at-home order was issued, I immediately did the thing that I ask all of you as my audience and got curious, So I have this saying that when pain shows up, we can get reactive or we can get curious. And it's my experience and opinion that when we choose to actually dig in and learn from pain and push the pause button on our reactivity, which could mean our fear and our desire to get this uncomfortable feeling gone, we can learn something that in the long run actually helps us gain wisdom and evolve, and ironically actually have less pain. So this channel of Mobility Mastery, where this video is going to come out, is mostly physical pain, but I often talk about our relationship to our environments and toxicity and trauma, my experience with trauma and emotion and everything being connected. So I'm very excited to talk to Dr. Kaufman today about what's going on and see if we can get curious together, dig in, and learn something. So welcome, Dr. Kaufman.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia. And please call me Andy.
Okay, Andy, thank you. Yeah, I'm super excited to talk to you. Been watching quite a few of your interviews. And I want to say right off the bat that there's a lot of interviews and information out there that people can look at, and I will link to what I think are really relevant videos that you've done on some of the kind of scientific clinical aspects of this COVID situation with the PCR testing. So if anyone is listening to this, if you're listening to this and you haven't actually gotten curious about COVID, I really recommend watching some of these videos with Dr. Kaufman on the PCR testing, because that's kind of what he's gotten known for. But I'm actually interested in going a slightly different direction today, because he's already talked about those topics elsewhere. And I guess I want to maybe just ask before we kind of dive into the deep end, which I tend to do. I tend to kind of skip the pleasantries and dive right into the deep end. But Andy, I would like to just ask if, maybe there's somebody new right now who doesn't know who you are. What should they know about you, or what would you want people to know before we kind of dive into the deep end here?
Yeah, sure. Well, first I want to say that I really appreciate your approach to pain, and I think that is exactly the right approach to take to this situation, is to, be curious and ask yourself a lot of questions about what's going on and try to put things together and see if it makes sense to you. And of course, watching the mainstream media could be a major barrier to that, because they only tell one story and it's the same story. And it seems like on virtually all the networks, they're telling the same exact thing. So if you want to really, figure out what's going on, you have to look at information yourself. And that's what I've done. So, basically, I'm a regular type of doctor. I started my career as a physician assistant. I worked in cancer medicine. Before that, I actually worked for the health department in New York City under a CDC-sponsored position doing AIDS surveillance. So I was like reporting AIDS cases that I would find in hospitals and clinics. And then after medical school, I decided to specialize in psychiatry because I really was just fascinated by the range of human behavior that you see among psychiatric patients. And I felt like I fit in with that community. I got along with the other psychiatrists and just, felt at home. But as I began practicing, and especially once I was already an MD and was expected to work with patients and using the principles of modern psychiatry, which is mostly prescribing medications, I just began noticing that the patients were not getting better. And we had this journal club in my residency at Duke where we critically analyzed research articles. And there was kind of a pivotal moment when we saw this study that had come out where a researcher had, through the Freedom of Information Act, was able to get all of the studies submitted for antidepressants to the FDA because, people, when they do research studies, they only publish the trials that show a positive benefit for their drug. The ones that don't show a benefit, they don't publish, but they still have to submit it when they get approval for the drug. And I remember that when all of this data was combined, the benefit of antidepressants disappeared. And this was like a real shocking thing because basically the conclusion was antidepressants don't do anything beyond placebo. And we were expected to prescribe antidepressants to everyone. So I was like looking to the leadership of the residency to tell us, we should stop prescribing these or we should use them sparingly. But there was no such pronouncement. And then like a year later or so, this big black box warning came out from the FDA about antidepressants, saying that they increase suicidal behaviors. And what we were instructed to do as trainees was simply to see them more frequently when we started them on an antidepressant. But we were told, don't worry, this is just like a kind of cover your butt scenario. It's not real, right? We know that depression is what causes suicidal behavior, not antidepressants. But as I began to practice and observe for myself that people weren't getting better, I started to question things more. And I kind of got to a point in practicing psychiatry that instead of prescribing medications, I was taking my patients off all their medications. And they did much better. And in fact, what I observed when I took them off antidepressants is many of the people who were having a lot of suicidal thoughts, they went away after I took them off the medication. So this kind of, reinforced my suspicion about that, most of what they do in modern allopathic medicine does not work. And of course, I thought back to my days as a physician assistant working with cancer patients. And, aside from a couple of rare cancers that were actually treated with natural things, like there's one type of leukemia that you treat with a version of vitamin A, those were the only patients that got better. Everyone else that got the conventional chemotherapy died. And so putting all this together opened me up to look elsewhere. And I read this book by Kelly Brogan called A Mind of Your Own. And she's also a psychiatrist.
It's on my bookshelf over there.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And she's a great person. And, we've been in touch recently and it's been fantastic to be able to speak to her. But I read her book and I was really impressed. And I decided I want to try this out. And so someone I had previously worked with was looking for some psychiatric help for an anxiety problem that she had tried everything under the sun to address. I mean, even had like a cardiac workup, like every kind of test, psychotherapy, drugs, everything. And nothing helped. So I decided, like I said, hey, I want to try this out. I think it could be really helpful. I won't charge you any money. We'll do it together. I'm going to do the same protocol, which I did. And it worked out just amazingly well. And in the end, we learned that it was gluten that was causing her anxiety, and she was basically cured as long as she didn't eat any more, processed wheat products. And I was just, amazed that something so simple. And, prior to that, when the whole gluten sensitivity thing came out among doctors, I was extremely skeptical. I mean, most of us doctors, we were joking around, basically saying that it's a psychosomatic thing, that it's just in people's heads, right? But after I had this experience, it really helped open me up to the possibility that almost everything that I was taught was not correct. And that started me on a big excavation down the rabbit hole of medicine. And so for about 3 years, I studied natural and alternative healing from a variety of sources, but Dr. Jennifer Daniels has been one of my biggest influences. And I didn't know exactly how to find people who are willing to work this way, because it's such a different paradigm. Like in regular medicine, people, especially in psychiatry, people, they're really down on their luck, they're suffering immensely, and they come to you and they want you to solve their problems because that's how they're told it works.
Yeah.
But in natural healing, it's not like that at all. It's basically you come to the realization that you actually caused the problem. You may not have done it consciously, like you didn't know necessarily, right? But it's something you did, like you ate a certain type of food filled with chemicals or, something else. And that's the cause of the problem. So in order for people to work under those circumstances to regain their health, they have to then take responsibility to solve that problem. And I realized my role is more of like a teacher. Like I help them figure it out and provide the information, but it's totally up to them to carry out these things and decide for themselves if they agree, and then they will get the benefit. And so like I tried a little bit in my local area with people just through like a casual referral that I didn't plan. And, it worked out okay in the beginning because people did follow things and they got better, but they weren't willing to like kind of take it to the full extent necessary. And so I think most of the people I started to work with, they ended up going back into the regular system and, taking drugs. And, I hope they're doing okay.
Yeah.
But once I started doing some interviews and talking publicly, which, by the way, like I contemplated the risks of doing that for a whole year before I decided to actually come out and criticize medicine and talk about natural healing, because I knew that my livelihood would be in jeopardy if I did this, and perhaps even my personal safety, because there are other natural practitioners who have died suddenly at an early age under suspicious circumstances. So, not to belabor that point, but it's just the things that I was thinking about. But interestingly, it was last November when I decided to kind of come out of the medical closet. And, I think there was some kind of destiny because it was right before this pandemic hit. And, maybe I had something important to contribute and it was my time. So since that time, I've had people wanting to actually do this, and they come to me. And I mean, almost every time they've already done their own research. They've already tried things on their own, that maybe they've worked with other natural healing practitioners and are just, want to see what I have to say about it. So it's been extremely rewarding. And people have made just incredible progress. Like all these diseases that I was told as a physician and through medical school that we don't know what causes it, there's no cure for it, right? All we can do is maybe make it tolerable for the rest of your life. Like people can cure themselves of most of these things. I mean,
Yep.
completely, cured, where it's not an issue anymore. Even autoimmune disorders and all kinds of things, diabetes, etc. So it's been really just an extremely amazing process to be able to transition over to this kind of work and have enough people that are willing to take the risk to speak with me and get this information and try it. That, I'm so grateful that everything happened this way.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you about the timing of this, like, what's gone through your mind about about, because I heard you say that you were thinking about it for a year, and I wanted to ask you why now? But obviously, you kind of tiptoed, I think, out a little bit, right, with the videos that I've seen on your channel and maybe in other places that I'm unaware of. Yeah, and then suddenly you are the guy on YouTube talking about PCR testing. We've actually not identified anything other than some genetic material, and we haven't actually proven a new infectious disease. So you kind of it's just interesting. Like, I'm curious what you think about, did you ever think you'd be that guy, like?
Well, I didn't even know if that guy would ever exist. I mean, I certainly didn't predict the situation we're in right now. And it's, I think I've been more surprised than anyone. Like even though I know that I'm capable of reading scientific papers and understanding what they mean, never thought that anyone would take me seriously or really listen to what I had to say. So I just feel so blessed because, my real mission is just to get the truth about health and disease out to people, because I want them to know, because I want them to be able to, take care of themselves and their family.
Yeah.
And I wasn't thinking about, popularity or acceptance. I was just thinking, I just want to get this information out because it's important. And, I was lucky enough to be able to understand it in some way that is, different from the authorities, because I think, whether they understand it or not, they're not telling the truth to people.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I would like to actually rewind a little bit to a few things you said, just kind of sharing some of your story. So in describing your process of kind of awakening to, a different reality, I guess, right? Maybe just a bigger reality. The other one's still there, just around health and the medical world. I'm just so curious, like, why do you think that? So in my opinion, science is supposed to be about data. It's supposed to be objective. We're supposed to take reactivity and personal subjective, our subjective selves kind of out of the equation and actually put all these puzzle pieces on a table outside of us and be able to look at it and let the information actually paint a picture instead of us projecting, what we want or don't want to see in the world onto the data. Why do you think you were able to see the objective data there when you were looking at, what did you say it was, vitamin A curing leukemia?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you were objectively observing things, right, in front of you, and you just decided to actually look at the data and let it tell you something other than what you're being told by, maybe the medical community or your peers or your teachers. So why do you think that is so rare? And what, in this paradigm of science, because we're supposed to be worshiping science right now with this COVID situation, right? Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx and the science. I actually haven't seen them present any science.
No, of course they don't. I mean, they're what I would call a technocracy. But, first of all, like, you asked me the tough questions, so I appreciate that. It's very difficult, and I don't have a really clear answer of why there are some people that are open to seeing things more objectively and truthfully, and other people just can't open up to it. And I wish I did know the exact answer, because I would so much like to be able to help people see the truth of things more clearly. But, I think there are some reasons that are highly influential, and, we can talk about it on different levels. So one big thing, that there was a shift toward materialist philosophy and science that occurred at the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of things came out of that, including germ theory. And that's essentially a philosophy that there is no spirit or consciousness or higher being or God, that everything, all the properties that we observe in nature of every aspect of beings and things, comes from the material itself. And all other properties arise from the physical material. And this kind of philosophy is what we are all born into. And germ theory is a big part of that, which essentially says that there is a harmful disease-causing entity, right, a germ, which comes from outside of our body and invades us and causes us to be ill. And there's nothing we can do about it. And we have to rely on some expert or authority with a magic potion to help us and cure us from these things. And even as a little child, right, we are told to cover our nose and our mouth or stay away from the sick person in our family because they'll get us sick or we'll spread germs, right? And if you just like stop and question, what is the meaning of the word germ? So germ means new life or new growth. And if you study like developmental biology, you'll know that like the egg and the sperm are called germ cells. And that's where everything originates from. So calling a germ something that makes us sick is like an inversion of the meaning. And many things are like that in this materialist paradigm. And those things, like I learned over time, are kind of clues to look into something and see, you know, what the truth is. But I think one really important thing for me was learning about the philosophy of science. And it was kind of a rogue psychiatrist, Niall McLaren, whose book I came across at the end of my training that helped me see this. But essentially, science is really about disproving whatever the current theory is. So in order to fortify like a scientific theory or idea that has some evidence behind it, all the other scientists should try to disprove it as hard as they can. And if they are unable to, then it must be legitimate. But if they can disprove it, then you should throw it away and develop a new theory, right? And this is how science is supposed to evolve. But that's not really what occurs in our current system of science and research, because I think money is just a huge factor. Because we've evolved into a system, and you know, maybe evolved is the wrong word because maybe it was actually designed this way, where almost all of the funding that supports research projects and the salaries of scientists comes either from the government or it comes from big corporations like pharmaceutical corporations that are only motivated by profit. And the government has complete control. And so since they've adopted germ theory, all of the science related to illness is going to be revolving around germ theory. Like a great example of this is from the 1970s, Nixon had a program called the War on Cancer. And you'd think that would be a great thing because cancer has become a major disease causing a lot of deaths in our culture. But that funding was not really about cancer. It was about trying to find a virus that causes cancers or viruses that cause cancer. And billions of dollars were spent. And in the end, really, that nothing substantial was discovered because, you know, viruses don't cause cancer. So it's this kind of thinking and this kind of research program that really narrows the focus. And scientists, instead of being curious or trying to disprove theories, they can't get funding to do that. They can't support their salary and stay in their career doing that. So they have to follow where the money is. And that is, you know, developing new antibiotics or new therapeutic drugs that fit the current paradigm rather than questioning it. So we've kind of got into this intellectual black hole of scientific advancement. And it took me a lot of years to be able to see this because I was totally programmed and, you know, brainwashed into all of these things. You know, vaccines are great. Germ theory is valid. You know, pharmaceuticals are the major advance of our modern society. And it really was a long, slow process for me to completely get out of that way of thinking. And there's a lot of costs for it because obviously I had to change my career. And, you know, I even was fired from my last psychiatric job, which really was a blessing in disguise because it forced me to go into this new area and figure out how to do it, you know, for my livelihood. And I wanted to do that but necessity is the mother of invention. So I got that little kick in the pants, and it really helped propel me forward. And there was some difficult times during the transition, but like I feel like things are just amazing right now. So not everybody's had the benefit of those experiences, and so many people ask me why there aren't more doctors and nurses and pharmacists and other medical people coming forward now, and it's really because of those barriers that it seems so risky. You'll have to change your life around. Everything will be disrupted. And even though everything is already disrupted by the pandemic and the reaction to it, it still, seems insurmountable for most.
Yeah. So, excuse me. This kind of brings me back to one of the other things you said, kind of coming full circle with it, about working with a few of the people that you did initially, and then seeing them maybe go back to traditional psychiatry and, taking care of our own health, whether it's physical health, mental health, social health, or relationship health, it is a responsibility, and I guess, I have a theory that this is partly why, we're in the situation we're in, but I would love, for you to share your thoughts on that. In particular, I had a question that I knew I wanted to ask you before we hopped on Zoom here, which is that, you're a psychiatrist by trade and training, which means you're an MD that specializes in mental and emotional health. And I'm curious if you could define for us, at least from your perspective, what characterizes mental and emotional health, and then what can we actually learn about the collective mental and emotional health of humanity right now through the perspective of COVID and our response to it?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because I don't think in my psychiatric training, I was ever really taught that. It was all focused on how do you diagnose disease and how do you use pharmaceuticals. And I think there's been a major increase in at least the reported or the diagnosed mental illness in our nation and, most of the world, which is completely false. So I'll tell you a little anecdote, because I used to go to some psychiatric conferences, and sometimes, excuse me, sometimes I gave a presentation, and but I developed, a lot of friendships. And there was one night I was at a conference in San Diego, and there were a group of about 12 of us, all psychiatrists, sitting around a table, drinking a beer. And one person said, wanted to take a survey of the group, and said, how many of us, qualify for a diagnosis of a mental illness? And I was the only one who didn't raise my hand. And it made me look really pompous at the time. But the thing is, these are a group of highly functioning individuals. Many of them had families. They're successful in business, or they're in academic positions. They're giving conferences, they're giving talks at conferences all over the world. They're working as expert witnesses for attorneys and sometimes in high profile cases. And I'm thinking, where's the dysfunction here? None of you are mentally ill, but they all were looking at it in a way, basically like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And of course, everyone that comes in, you never go into a psychiatrist's office and don't get a diagnosis, perhaps except for my office. So I think we really have lost a complete sense of what it's like to be healthy and what is the difference from healthy and disease. Yeah. And, so healthy psychologically or mentally healthy does not mean that you're happy all the time, right? That's just not really possible for virtually anyone. But in order to attain that state, you have to do, years of development on yourself, if it's possible for you. So I think it has to do with how we're able to balance things in our life. If we have good quality relationships, if we're able to maintain productive activity, if we're able to meet our obligations like caring for our children adequately, taking care of our homes and our finances. Like those are essentially the measures of psychological health. And they don't have to be perfect, just good enough. Like I'm blanking on the name right now, but perhaps someone in your audience knows, but there was a pediatrician in the 60s who extensively studied what is the minimum requirement for parents in order for the child to turn out okay. And what he found out was essentially that you have to have just one parent or caretaker. Now, it doesn't even have to be a parent, it could be someone else, who gives a crap and does what he termed, good enough. So in other words, if you try and really care, then you're going to be okay. And, you have to expect that there are going to be difficult times in life. Like we're all going through a difficult time right now. And it's how you come out of those times. Like, what's your degree of resilience? Can you keep moving forward? Can you recognize when you're in a toxic or abusive relationship and not continue to accept that treatment from other people? So I think those are the most important measures. Of course, you can develop yourself way beyond that sort of minimal standard of health. But I think most people, if they are sad about something or don't feel like going to work one day, that would be diagnosed as depression. I can't tell you how many times I've read a medical record from, not just psychiatrists, but primary care doctors where it goes like this: patient reports being depressed, diagnosis depression, and no other discussion took place, right? And that's not how you, find out if someone is really, really struggling or not. But that's the way we look at it, because then you can justify a prescription for an antidepressant drug. And so you can meet all your requirements and move on. And people have bought this, just like they buy a lot of things.
Yeah, so let's rewind a little bit again, because I want to dig into this, particular paradigm we're in, I guess, where, what I see is a lot of people want to outsource authority over their own body and over their own mind. And they want someone else to tell them, this is what's wrong, and you can take this pill to fix it, maybe, or just change this one thing in your life. And then, we usually want it to be fast and easy and, and cheap, hopefully. We're just kind of in, like, where did this paradigm come from, do you think? Where we've kind of given up sovereignty of our own, being responsible for our own health.
Well, we can definitely go really deep to answer this question, but I'm going to refrain from that for the moment. And I think that it's cultural. So many aspects to it. So one is that we have lost the knowledge of how to do things for ourselves, right? We don't know how to make our own clothing. Many of us don't even know how to cook our own meals. We don't know how to grow our own food or hunt or make our own repairs to our homes, right? So much of it has just gone by the wayside, that we now have a system where we pay people to do those things or we ask for help, but we don't feel it's our responsibility to do those things. And I think the mandatory or compulsory schooling has a large role in this, because when you're a very young child, right, you look to your parents as authority figures, and rightfully so, because you need that guidance and you need to learn how to interact successfully with your environment and with other people. And then we, send our children to these schools where we essentially let strangers raise them. And one of the big things there is now the teacher and the principal and the guidance counselor, they become the authority figures. And the children have to ask them permission even to use the bathroom, right, in the school. So this is a kind of programming or acculturation to get us to always acquiesce to authority and not make decisions on our own. Like even the decision of how to engage in our own bodily functions, we have to appeal to an authority figure. And this same thing goes for the intellectual development, because we're not taught about critical thinking and reasoning and having our own opinions and how we find information on our own. Instead, we're spoon-fed information that's highly censored and designed, right? Like, I mean, Rockefellers had a major influence in medical education, but also in general education, where they essentially found young historians who were up and coming, who were already like-minded to their viewpoints, and had them write the textbooks that became the standard textbooks in the school about American history. So the American history that's taught in schools is not really the American history that has gone on in our nation. And so everything, and, you know, being spoon-fed this information and just accept it, right? Like, this is certainly true with germ theory, but I remember when I first discovered this with my children, and they're, you know, at a private Montessori school, which is way better, in my opinion, in how they do the education than a compulsory school. But my son, in, I think it was third grade, he was doing a report on the planets. And he was super excited about space and planets and all this kind of thing. But he showed me some of the books that he'd gotten from the school library to learn about this. And I noticed that certain things in there were not what they seemed. Like, for example, they showed these photographs of the planet, and then you could see in the fine print, or if you look them up on a government website, you'd see that they were actually computer graphics and not an actual photograph. So they were rendered by like a graphic artist. And then this thing bothered me the most. They had this model of the structure of the planet, like that it was a ball, and in the middle there was a molten iron core, right? Just like they tell us is about the Earth, and then the mantle and this whole structure. And in the books that they're giving the kids, it's spoken of as fact, not as a theoretical model. But in actuality, we've only drilled 8 miles into the Earth's surface, which doesn't even get beyond the layer of what they call the crust in that model. So we have no idea what's beneath the Earth's surface. This is just a theoretical model. And I happened to meet at an observatory a graduate student in astrophysics. And I asked her about this because, you know, they have, for all these planets that they've observed with microscopes and et cetera, they have this structure. So I said, what's this based on? Because I know we haven't drilled into these planets and taken samples, you know, or we certainly haven't sliced them open and taken a look, right? So she told me that it's based on the elements that are in the star, that they just assume that's what the planet's made of. And that's all there is to it.
Wow.
And I was just blown away, because I see they're teaching this as a fact to the school children, and they don't teach them how to question or reason. They just say, from the authority figure, this is the information. And so it really should be no surprise that in the current situation that people are just willing to turn on the TV, which has the newscaster who looks just like a teacher in a way, right? Definitely an authority figure. And they tell you the information. They don't say, well, there's a study that showed, you know, probability of this, and, you know, the confidence intervals overlapped 1, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. You know, they're not saying that at all. They're saying, oh, this is really scary. You have to protect yourself, right? Like, you have to wear masks, for example, which there's not one study to support that. No scientific evidence, but yet they're saying it as if it's fact, and it's really scary also. So it triggers that kind of emotional response, just like, you know, when you're out of line in the classroom and that teacher says, you know, sit still, young man, right? It's like that trigger, and then you straighten up and sit still. And so this is, I think, you know, where a lot of this acculturation comes from, and it's lifelong, and it's very sophisticated.
Yeah, so what you just described, you know, the way we just turn on the TV, we listen to the authority figure, it's acculturated, it's just in us, it's habituated. This fits into something that I've termed a nervous system pattern. I've actually Googled it to see if other people are calling it this, and I haven't really found anything. But what I mean by that is, you know, our nervous system really learns behavior. so that it can automate it for us. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but
yeah, a conditioned response.
Yeah, and actually it's wonderful, because if we had to remember how to talk and walk and cook our food and put our pants on every day, every day we'd be learning how to be human over and over and over. So it's really amazing, but then it also can bite us in the butt, because, we get habituated to things that maybe aren't serving us very well. So I'm curious if, when you look at the world right now, like, I'm just seeing all kinds of people acting out habituated or automated nervous system patterns. Is that something you could speak to at all? Because, this is just my scientific mind, even though I'm not qualified, just observing myself and other people.
Well, no, I think what you hit upon is what's called behavioral conditioning. And so, of course, mostly they teach this in, like intro psychology courses at the college level. But when I was in my residency training, and I tried to focus a lot on psychotherapy, because I thought that was something that could be much more useful, especially, combined with the other things. And so I remember a psychologist recommended this book, and it's like you could get it for like 50 cents on a used bookstore website, called Don't Shoot the Dog. And it's about conditioning, and it's basically saying you can train, right, a dog using the same kind of techniques that you described to have automatic behavior in response to certain stimuli. Well, it turns out that the psychologist also said, by the way, you can use this on your girlfriend or your family without them even knowing it, and alter their behavior. And that process is called shaping. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing that you use, when you're training animals. So I think what you're describing is really a conditioned response, that you have already been trained to respond a certain way to this authority when you're being directed, especially in a certain situation that's like a crisis, right? Which is a special, it's just like, all those fire drills that you might have had in school, right? It's like, you better be perfect during the fire drill, because they have zero tolerance for any acting out during that time. And, essentially we've been on like a 4-month fire drill. And so people are, getting in line and displaying the exact kind of response that they're expected to. And I think they've done it actually to a higher degree than anticipated by the puppet masters.
I don't know whether to be in awe or horrified. Because, we've kind of already touched on it, but one of the other questions I wanted to ask you today was, when this all started, I watched people I knew, friends of mine, tell me, nope, not going to get dinner with you after all. I'm social distancing. I'm, sheltering at home. And this was before the order even came. Somehow the words shelter in place came into the world before it was even a mandate. And I really hadn't been watching the news, and I was just like, what? What is this? This is really bizarre behavior. Like, I've never seen people behave like this. And so that's when I dug in immediately. I got curious. I wanted to know what is going on. And that's when I found one of your first videos, The Human is Not a Virus, and then many others as well. But in the beginning, it was 2 weeks. We're going to shelter in place for 2 weeks, let the hospitals gear up. And I had so many people arguing with me on, privately and on Facebook, Alicia, why are you freaking out? Like, this is just for 2 weeks. It's to save people. Like, we can handle anything for 2 weeks. It's not a big deal. And here we are 4 months later, still being told to stay 6 feet away from people. There are mandatory mask orders in my town. I don't wear them. I haven't worn a mask this entire time. But I think I'm, again, just kind of like a little bit in awe, but also horrified at how easily we are habituated to behavior.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing, isn't it? And, I never called it shelter in place, because that's what you do to wait out a storm, right? If there was a hurricane, you might shelter in place. But what has happened there is we've been put under house arrest.
Yeah.
And I too am shocked at how easily people went along with this because, I've learned about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right? And the First Amendment has completely been violated, for everyone, and many aspects of it, right? Because there are several different rights in the First Amendment, but we still don't have the right to assemble unless it's for a certain type of approved political protest. But if you want to go and protest being under house arrest, that's not acceptable, right? Only certain sanctioned protests that are probably part of the program. But you're right. A freedom of religion has been taken away. We just had Easter not too long ago, and people could not go to their church to celebrate Easter and pray. And these are the things that our nation is founded upon, the freedoms. I mean, even with as much propaganda as they might teach in the schools, they still have taught that, right? And that's always been the justification for all the wars that we have gone in, right? Even the current recent wars on terrorism, it's they're defending our freedom. Well, now what is there to defend? We have lost the freedoms, and I don't think they're going to give it back to us because we've reached, if you look at the numbers of cases and such, we're basically, it's all over. And yet we still don't have our freedoms back.
Yeah, I just learned something very alarming today that in the city of Boulder, so I'm in Durango, Colorado, but I lived in Boulder for 8 years and I have a lot of friends there, and the city just revised, what is it? I have it written somewhere because I knew I wasn't going to remember this word. I'm not finding it. Basically, they can now evict tenants because they revised some abatement nuisance, public nuisance order or something like that. So if you are gathering in your own home with more than 10 people and making noise or not social distancing, they can now evict you from your own home. I was just like, what? All for, maybe, probably not, but maybe I could get on board with this kind of draconian thinking if, there was like a 20% death rate or something, something really obscene.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like, we have forgotten how to make our own observations by just looking outside at what's going on, right? And, if you look back, there's a couple of survivor accounts from the 1918 flu pandemic, right? And that wasn't caused by a virus either, but that's another complicated matter. But certainly during that time, there were many, many deaths. I mean, the numbers range from 10 million to 100 million. So we're talking about, quite a lot of people. And the eyewitness accounts were basically like, yeah, the cemeteries were all filled up, so people had to bury their relatives in their backyard. I mean, people were just dropping like flies left and right. And, here I'm in Syracuse, New York. We have about 500,000 population. I haven't seen one sick person at all in my day-to-day experience. And this may have been a couple of weeks ago that I last checked. There were 14 people who had this illness in out of 500,000. And yet the whole city has been completely shut down, except for some grocery stores and, of course, the big corporate big box stores. So yeah, it's just totally insane. And I don't know how people cannot realize it. It's really astonishing, but nonetheless, that's the way it is. Right. And, I do try to engage some people when it's important. Like, for example, my children's best friends, I have young children, and they've really been suffering as a result of being, taken out of their school, taken away from their friends. And their best friends, aren't allowed to play with them and haven't been for months. Mm-hmm. And I tried to engage the parents in a discussion. I try to occasionally gently send them a scientific paper or an analysis. And they're just so paralyzed with fear that they won't even, talk to me about it. They just say kind of thank you. And then that's it. And nothing changes. Mm-hmm. Right. And last week, one of my daughter's best friend, told her that basically they can start playing together again if my daughter wears a mask. And, so I tried to talk to the parent about it and, tell them that actually it's extremely harmful psychologically and physically for your health to wear a mask. And there's no evidence that it's helpful in any way. And, there was just no ability to even have a discussion about it. It was just like, thank you. And, but not really, thank you wasn't really what they meant. What they really meant is, why don't you get on board with the program?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's, seems to be the predominant attitude here in Durango as well, even though there have been 0 deaths. The state counted the one guy who drank himself to death and was tested positive post-mortem, but the county did not count him in their totals. And they've only had 11 hospitalizations since the start.
Right. Well, there's someone that I knew from a long time ago who's a healthcare professional, and she lives in Colorado. And I remember this was fairly early on, right after they just started. The CDC gave the directive to basically label every death a COVID death if there's suspicion, quote unquote. And her mother had advanced Alzheimer's disease in a nursing home. And unfortunately she passed. It was her time. And the next day was a Facebook post, my mother died of COVID-19. And I was like, what are you talking about? How can you even, but it's like, but that's the mantra.
Yeah. So I'm most interested, I think, in exploring with the rest of our time here this paradigm that we're in. Einstein's quote comes to mind that we can't solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. And, so it gets me thinking, what level of thinking created all these problems we have? And when I say problems, what I'm actually talking about is, okay, so even if COVID were real, I'm not saying it's not real. People are dying for some reason or other. But even if it were 100% the way they say it is, okay, let's go with that for a sec. Everywhere I look, we're sick. We are in pain. We're physically in pain. That's what I, work with people on. But we have emotional trauma that we're not healing. There's mental illness, emotional distress. There's a huge financial collapse, and then division and, not being able to even talk to each other, like you just described with your child's best friend and their parents, like not even being able to have a human conversation. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around it, and I'm having a hard time understanding what got us here, like what level of thinking, created all of this that we're seeing out the world, which I believe this current situation is just highlighting what was already there. It brought what was latent in all of us on an individual level and collective level, I believe, to the surface. So in that sense, I think it's a great opportunity. So I'd love for you to, share from your perspective, what level of thinking do you think got us to this point where we're so sick in so many ways? And then what level of thinking, new thinking, will we have to create to actually solve these problems?
Yeah. Well, I think it's actually more of a level of not thinking that got us into this place. And we've just allowed ourselves to be controlled and manipulated by all these kind of forces. Right. And this has been sort of a long-term strategy. I mentioned before about materialism, that was a really key philosophical viewpoint to come from. And it led to what might be called scientism. Many have called it that, where we've come to now believe in science rather than trust science or question and scrutinize science with skepticism, because science is really about skepticism, but it's become dogmatic and like a new religion, right? Atheism and scientism go together. And, we've allowed this to happen to a large degree in our society. And we have succumb to like the programming of people like Edward Bernays. And anyone who hasn't or not familiar, they've never heard the name Edward Bernays or haven't read about him, it's really important because he is basically the father of propaganda and public relations, which are really the same thing. We might call them advertising and marketing. But it's been an extremely successful way to manipulate a population over time into totally changing how they think about things. Like one early example of this is that it used to be the custom at a workplace that there would be a metal cup next to the drinking fountain, and it would be on a chain. And anyone who was thirsty would go and, fill up the metal cup and take a drink. And it was the communal cup. Right. And there were no problems from this. No one got sick. But Bernays instituted this campaign because he was working with a paper company which manufactured Dixie cups. Right. And we all remember the old Dixie cups. And basically, they started telling people that they were getting each other sick by sharing the same cup. And this kind of fit in with the germ theory paradigm, which was relatively new at the time, but had really already taken hold. And so people stopped using the communal cup and instead bought disposable Dixie cups, right? And so we essentially live in a disposable society, that we think everything has to be convenient and disposable, right? We can't make food. Instead, we eat manufactured food made with chemicals that aren't real food. We don't take responsibility to learn about things. Instead, we turn on the news to have it spoon-fed to us instead of trying to figure out things for ourselves, right? We don't question scientific discoveries or technology, or we don't ask what are the consequences of these things. We just go with them, and we have basically become almost a society of addicted people, because it seems like almost everyone has an addiction. And what I mean by that is a repetitive behavior that if you try to stop doing it, you'll be craving it. And so you may not be addicted to heroin, or you may not be an alcoholic, but how long can you go without your smartphone, or without checking Facebook, or without turning on the TV or Netflix, or watching your sports, right? And all of these things are distractions. And we've allowed ourselves to be distracted from the important things, right? The important things are family, being in touch with the land and with nature, having good food, clothing, and shelter, right? Our sustenance, building for the future, teaching our children, preparing them to be independent. And our modern life has just gotten away from all of these things. And I think these are really the central themes that have led us down this path of being manipulated and controlled, and just being willing to give up our own freedom and sovereignty at the drop of a hat, just because some authority figure told us to.
Perfect. Very in alignment with my own beliefs. So you just said something really important about giving up our freedom and our sovereignty. What is freedom to you? How would you describe or define freedom?
Well, I would say it's the ability to make your own decisions about every aspect of your life. And I think it's important to mention that it doesn't include every possible behavior, right? Because we have to follow what I would refer to as natural law. Some people might call this God's law, but it's the law that if you just think about it, you know what is moral and not moral. And you could just simplify it into the golden rule, right? Which basically means do unto others as you would do unto yourself. So you can't steal things from other people because that infringes upon their freedom. And you can't carry out acts of violence against other people unless you're acting out of self-defense, right? And it's got to be a very clear self-defense, like you have no other choice, not, preemptive action to defend yourself. But as long as you're not infringing on anyone else's freedom, you should be able to do anything you want. If you want to walk around town with no clothes on, If you want to ingest or smoke any material or substance, all of these things are part of freedom. And of course, this is what is most difficult about freedom for people in our modern culture and society, is that it comes with a responsibility, right? So if you have freedom, you can't necessarily expect someone else to bail you out of trouble. And you can't infringe upon others people's rights, and you have to meet your own needs, right? And of course, I think that our true nature is that of being cooperative and helpful and collaborative, and that our true nature is not to get each other and dog eat dog. I think that is something that's been put upon us, through Wall Street and popular culture and all of the wars that we have been in our modern era, but it's not our true nature. So when if we were all free and there was someone who was struggling or had a certain handicap or barriers, that other people would just naturally want to help them. And you can see this spontaneously in your life, because we still have this to some degree. We won't take it necessarily very far as our true nature, because it's been programmed out of us, but we'll still, if someone stops and asks us for the time, we'll tell them the time. If they ask for directions and they're lost, we'll try to help them find the way. We still do this just instinctively. And so I think that if we really experienced freedom, that this would be, much more evident, and it would just be, a fantastic way of being. And it's something that I strive for. And I think that we have actually an opportunity in the future to free ourselves from this oppressive system and really have 2 feet on the land and really realize ourselves as sovereign, free human beings of nature.
I would love to back up with and combine what you just said with, a new level of thinking, right? If we're going to actually solve these problems, then we have to, like you said, start thinking to begin with. And maybe that's your answer as to how to solve the problems, actually learn to think, which sounds kind of ludicrous. What do you mean learn to think? Of course I'm thinking, so what do you actually mean when you say learn to think, and how can we apply that to what you just said to create that future?
Right. Well, on the one hand, I'm just talking about critical analysis, skepticism, not just, believing things because someone says it, but actually finding out for yourself, making your own true opinion, not echoing someone else's opinion, but making your own opinion. And that's a real big first step. But I think there's a bigger aspect, a spiritual aspect to this, that you have to realize that, we are not just our bodies, that we're so much more than that. And we have abilities that we can't even imagine, like to, manifest a new reality through our thought, our intention, right? And our kind of magic human nature, right? Which has been dumbed down out of us. And, but we've all had moments where we've recognized that it's true, right? We've had moments of inspiration and where we feel like this kind of divine light within inside of us, right? And I'm not a religious person and I wasn't raised Christian, but I really like the idea, the true idea of the writings about Jesus that basically said that he is within us all. And we are all Jesus in a sense, right? And so we can actually realize that nature of ourselves and rise up to the occasion and make a reality for ourselves and the people around us that is superlative. And it takes work to be able to do this. And there are many things against us, like, things like fluoride, for example, right, that's been put in our water, which is a neurotoxin. This is one of the things that dumbs us down. And there's studies that show it drops your IQ points, right? But there are many, many other things like this as well, like staring at screens, being programmed by the TV, being numbed out by drinking a lot of beer and, all of the other sort of psychoactive substances that we're always imbibing and being forced upon us or encouraged upon us. And so you have to be able to rise up out of those forces, and you have to do some serious spiritual type of work. And I don't mean prayer, and I don't mean, Buddhist meditation, but we need to find a way for ourselves. And for everybody, it's a unique and individual path. But it involves, I think, a first step is taking time at minimum of 20 minutes a day where you're by yourself. There's no devices, there's no noise, there's no extraneous stimulation. It's better if you're in a natural setting, even if it's just your backyard. But if you live near a park or you can be in a wooded area, it's even better. And you just be with yourself and let yourself have the experience of being alone with your thoughts. And if you do this on a regular basis, you're going to just start to have realizations about yourself and the world. And you're going to be able to guide yourself, or perhaps let the universal consciousness guide you to what you're supposed to do to become a better person. And if you just think about it as, I'm just going to try to become a better person, and I'm going to just open myself up to any idea that will make that happen, then you've just done a magical thing, because you've started yourself off on a path of discovery, maturation, development, and you're headed towards encompassing and embodying that divine spark that we all have. And if we simply do that and just start off on that path, that it's going to be just an incredible, incredible place to be.
I love it. And what you describe is curiosity. Maybe the cure for all of this is curiosity, and wondering. I love wondering and even not knowing, but I think not knowing is scary for a lot of people.
Well, I really love how you brought the words cure and curiosity together. I mean, that's a way of thinking that we've lost as well, to understand really the roots and meaning of language and symbolism. But the most important aspect for me about curiosity is, if you're curious, you haven't already decided what the answer is. So that means you're open to whatever the answer is to what you're curious about. And when you're open, then you're going to be able to find wisdom, knowledge, and understanding that you can judge if it's right for you, if it's the truth or not. And that's another important aspect. A lot of people call it discernment, and I like that word. But if you're not open and curious, then you're going to be stuck and stagnating.
Yeah, so this brings up a question. So I posted on my Facebook page that I was speaking to you and asked my friends if they had any questions. And I have a mix of like a lot of people that are currently like, don't come near me. If you're not wearing a mask, I want nothing to do with you. Quit talking about this, Alicia. And then other people that are very much in alignment with being curious and looking at what's happening. And somebody actually in the camp of, I think, quite on board with the mainstream narrative had a question that I actually was like, this is a great question, because I think we should all ask this of ourselves, and we should definitely ask it of any so-called authority figure. So this is, I won't name him, but this is what he asked. He said, I would ask him what his certainty, i.e. as a percentage, is about his various claims, and how he balances the desire to share the truth as he sees it with the possibility that he is wrong and potentially giving people harmful advice. And before you answer that, I just want to say I have no idea if he's actually listened to your videos or not. I don't think I've honestly really ever heard you give that much advice other than go do your own research, go think for yourself, go, don't believe me, like go on your own journey. But I actually was like, this is an amazing question. I would love to ask Dr. Fauci this. and Dr. Brooks.
Because I don't think they'd be honest with you about it, but it would be a good question for them.
Yeah, because they're sharing their truth as they see it, and in my opinion, they've been quite wrong.
Well, actually, in all fairness, like, now I can't speak for all of them, but like Dr. Fauci has come out and said things that were completely contradictory.
Yes.
Right. So early on, he said masks are useless. Right. Yep. And that is true, in my opinion. And then he also wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine on February 28th, which said that, this COVID pandemic is basically a seasonal flu with a mortality of 0.1%. So, so he has told something that's much closer to the truth, but not to the general public necessarily.
Right. I have read that paper. So, I was kind of joking about it a little bit, but I actually, like, in all seriousness, kind of wanted to ask his actual question, how do you, I don't know if I want you to ask it in percentages. That's what he said. I don't know how you can quantify.
Well, no, I think I might be able to if I phrase the point, correctly, but I, the first thing I thought of is exactly what you said. Like, I don't consider myself an authority figure at all. And I don't want to be. I don't want there to be authority figures. I have certain skills that I'm able to understand scientific papers because I have a lot of experience reading them critically. And I was taught that, I was taught that at MIT. I was taught that at Duke. So I'm simply utilizing my skills, and I know that not everybody has the same skill set. We all have unique skills, abilities, and talents, and some we develop and some we don't. And we all contribute in our own way. And, this just happens to be right now my biggest contribution is that I can read these papers and understand what is being said scientifically. But I would, definitely caution people against just accepting what I say. And I've made mistakes and I've corrected myself. And in fact, I really started off on this whole path by changing my opinion about every single thing that I researched. Because I was a proponent of vaccines. I was a proponent of germ theory. I fully thought viruses cause all kinds of diseases, right? And that's just in medicine and health. Like, we could talk about other areas too, where I've radically changed my opinion after doing research and learning from myself and making my own opinion. Because what I realized is that those opinions that I held previously weren't really mine. I was really just echoing people that I thought were respectable or in a position of authority that I acknowledged. And I didn't really do my homework and look for myself. But I can tell you, I can support one claim in a percentage, because this is something that I feel for myself very, very certain of, like 100% certain. And the thing I'm 100% certain about is that none of the papers that claim to have found a virus that causes a disease called COVID-19, none of them have found a virus at all. And I'd be happy to explain that in more detail, but I think I've done that in a pretty good degree so far. I am going to be actually trying to explain that to a medical student tomorrow on a sort of, I don't want to call it a debate, because debates are always like about sabotage, but we're going to have a discussion because, the medical student is basically being spoon-fed this information about viruses and Koch's postulates and things like that, just like I was. And, it's going to be fascinating when we actually take one of these papers and try to go through it line by line. And I'm going to, try to teach and explain what they've really done and how it's not what they said. And so I'm extremely confident about that, but I don't want you to just accept that either. Like, I want you to look into it yourself and make a decision for yourself. And, if you make your own decision, whatever it is, I would definitely respect you, worlds above the average, because that's all we can expect you to do. And I've had lots of interactions with other people who don't see things exactly the same way that I do, even though they have actually looked at this. And I still respect them, and I still am happy to have a discussion with them about it. But the important thing is, when you engage in a discussion, you have to always be willing to see the other person's point of view and be willing to change your mind. Otherwise, it's not productive. And what I see on social media is that when people disagree, that they don't do this in general. Instead, they use false arguments, logical fallacies, like things like ad hominem, right? Like I think there's kind of a whole cottage industry of people trying to debunk some of the things that I've reported on. But whenever I look at their material, and I don't spend a lot of time, because, it's hard to see people criticizing you. And I know that if there were real arguments, that they would be brought to my attention. But what I see is, I see people name calling and people questioning whether I'm really a doctor, things like that. And, it's pretty easy to verify my license or my education, but I'm not going to show my diploma on the screen. I don't need to. I think if you just listen to me talk, you'll realize that I know enough about medicine that I'd either be an extremely awesome actor or like I am really a doctor. But what I'd like to support is like real conversations where you're open, where you can, like, if someone says, look at this paper, that you can look at it and you can make your own opinion about it and maybe provide a counter argument based on what's in the paper, but not, just start saying, you're a risk, you're putting people in danger, or, like you're things like that, because that's not productive and it's not actually thinking, right? That's just echoing the authority's statement. So I hope that's an adequate answer, but I'd love to have a conversation with this gentleman, if I had the time, but and if he were willing, but that'd be my answer.
Yeah, I did tell him I thought it was a great question that we should probably ask anyone,
Yeah, I
including
agree.
ourselves. What am I giving myself good advice today? Or not, because we're always giving ourselves advice.
Yes, and a lot of times it is bad advice, right? Like, I can eat an extra cookie, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. I wanted to ask something. I'm losing my train of thought here, but based on what you were just saying, one, what do you think it indicates about somebody if there's just that instant reactivity to like shut you down or shut me down or shut anyone down on either side, right? Like I'm actually, oftentimes finding myself feeling in kind of like this narrow lane somewhere in the middle, because there are all these really angry, reactive people on both sides, and I'm not that interested in participating in that. I mean, I do get emotionally riled up at times because I want to be a free human being. I want to be able to do what I want to do in life. I didn't get to travel this spring and figure out where I want to move, and my life has been affected. But so what do you think causes that, just such an instant reactivity? And then maybe I'll just start with that and then follow it up.
Yeah, well, there's a time to be passionate and there's a time to be rational. And so one important thing is just knowing the context of what you're engaging in at the time. But, in my psychiatric experience and actually in my own study related to natural healing, the sort of mind-body connection, right, that are psychologically and physically, it's one thing, right? So it's artificial to really separate it because they interact at such a dynamic level. But there is one sort of conceptualization that I think is really useful here, and it sort of has called loosely shadow psychology. And I think it originally came from, I'm blanking on his name now. I always forget his name, but it's not Freud, but the other guy, that Carl Jung. Originally came up with it, but I think Robert Augustus Masters, who is a modern psychologist, writes about it really well for our current times. And basically is that we have, traumatic experiences throughout our life. And I don't mean, being a rape victim necessarily, although that certainly does happen more frequently than we'd like to admit. But we all have, traumatic experiences, and it could be a simple thing that, like you were really proud of some school project and you brought it home and your mom just kind of ignored you. Right. And it doesn't matter that, she had a bad day or, got diagnosed with an illness or whatever, her friend told her to F off, right? That was major disappointment to you. And you carry that around. If you don't process it in some way and integrate it into yourself, it becomes in the shadow. And, when I'm explaining this to teenagers, which I've done a lot, I sort of talk about when you're cleaning up your room and you have to be in a hurry, like you maybe in order to watch your favorite ball game, you have to clean up your room first, your mom tells you. And so you just put everything under your bed. Right. And it looks clean, but it's not really clean. And, each time you do that, you fill up the space under your bed. And at some point, it's going to be, bulging out of there. You can't contain it anymore. And this is kind of what happens to us when we have these little traumatic experiences. And some of them may be big and some of them may be little. But we just kind of sweep them under the rug or keep them in the shadow self, that they then come out, they get triggered. And they get triggered in ways that are predictable if you really understand yourself, if you've done the work to figure it out. But before that, it's like no understanding of it. And so when that trigger occurs, you react, right, with an emotion. Maybe you lose your temper, right? Or you do something that is unsavory or uncooperative. Or unserving to the greater good or to your own good. And we get caught up in these patterns. And then, and then they get more complex because we develop a relationship with someone and they trigger us in a certain way and we trigger them back. And then we keep repeating that over and over again, right? And it becomes a toxic relationship. And it takes the kind of development that I was talking about earlier to overcome this. And most people also, they try to fight against it. They look at like part of themselves as being bad. Like when I act out in that triggered way, I'm a bad person and I need to like punish myself or I need to suppress that part of myself. But that's not the approach that's the most successful. Actually, that response is there for a reason. It was appropriate in some way or served some purpose during the original trauma, but you never gave it credit for that or you didn't process it or realize it. And so the way to overcome that is to integrate those traumas and those reactions into the whole of yourself and realize that there may be a time when you need that part of yourself to come out when it's really appropriate and useful, but you don't want it to just like leak out and ruin a good time or cause friction in your relationships or other problems. So, that's really how I conceive of that issue and how to get beyond it.
I love that you went in this direction answering my question because so I've had a lot of trauma in my life. It's something I've blogged about, I've talked about publicly, so it's out there on my YouTube channel. And one of my great frustrations in trying to find someone to help me heal at the kind of emotional, psychological level is I went through something pretty big. And I don't need to go into it because I've already shared it with my audience, but and I don't mind if you ask me a follow-up question about it, but the main point I want to make is I went on this journey of trying to heal trauma and most of the time bumped into people who I felt were scared of my pain. And I also think we inside are scared of our own pain. And whether it's physical pain or emotional pain or this relational pain. So maybe you could just give us a few words on being with our own pain.
Well, yeah, I think this actually kind of brings us full circle to the beginning where we started, because, when I was learning psychiatry in my residency, I was assigned to the Veterans Hospital. And so I worked with a lot of veterans. Many of them were Vietnam era, and they had a lot of suffering and a lot of trauma and a lot of trigger reactions. But there was this thing, because most of them were men, and they were really afraid to express their emotions. And several of them had said, I'm worried that if I start crying, I'll never stop. And so instead they like suppress it and keep it inside. And I think many of us take that approach, the same thing as we do with physical pain. But when I worked with my, one of my spiritual mentors, Neil Kramer, he introduced this idea of the aperture of feeling. And that he acknowledges our common human condition to try and suppress or run away from these negative feelings. But it's really, really important to completely open up, because what emotions are, just like what physical pain is it's information. It's trying to give us a message that we need to learn from, that we need to change something or do something different or learn something about ourselves in order to deal with a situation, to become better, to have better relationships, whatever it is. That there's some purpose to it. And that it kind of follows this path where it increases, and depending on the severity, it may increase to the point, and this is Neil's description, like, you might be lying on the floor in a fetal position bawling, right? You may need to experience that degree, right? And when my marriage was breaking up, I did experience that degree of of pain and sorrow. But I didn't fight it. I let it work its way through me. And what happened is that it taught me quite a lot. And in fact, I think it really helped prepare me for dealing with what I'm dealing with now, because I get a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people are upset with me, including friends, just like I'm sure you're experiencing. And so I can deal with that actually just fine and smile through it now. Whereas before, I think I would just collapse from the rejection. So that's what I really needed out of that experience. And I don't know that it actually fully crystallized until this moment, to be honest with you. I knew it was, but I don't know that it was really completely crystal clear. But what happened is, once I started learning and changing, then it died down, right? It didn't stay that level forever. It stayed there long enough for me to figure out what I needed to learn. And the more you resist it, and the less you're open to it, it's going to keep coming, because you didn't get the information. So it keeps coming after you. And it might reach a point when it just goes away and you just fall apart because you can't function, right? It's just like your thirst mechanism. When you start to get a little dehydrated, right, you get really thirsty, and that's your signal. You better drink something. But if you get too wrapped up in the business of day-to-day stuff and getting stuff done, and you just ignore the thirst, after a time, it's going to go away. And then you're just going to be dehydrated and sick, right? And that's not the way you want to go. That's not the path that's the most pleasant, that's the most rewarding, that will teach you the lessons of life. Sometimes life is challenging and difficult. And there's got to be that balance too, because if you were just ecstatic and euphoric all the time, it would become meaningless, right? And this is why drug addiction leads to so much misery, because at first the drug makes you euphoric all the time, and then it doesn't, right? Because that's just not in our nature to be that way. So the key thing is really to allowing yourself to fully experience that emotion. Like maybe if you're in the middle of driving, you want to wait till you get home, but don't wait too long, because that is so valuable. Just like making mistakes. Making mistakes is the way to learn. And if you don't make the mistakes, you're not going to make progress. And if you don't suffer, you're not going to make progress. And if you don't experience pain, you're not going to make progress.
Beautiful. And yeah, definitely full circle with me and my audience, talking about pain and being willing to actually feel it and then get curious about it. And you just beautifully described something I attempt to teach through my own stories on my channel, And sometimes it lands for people, and sometimes I think they think I'm crazy. But I say, if we're willing to go through that process of feeling the pain and then getting curious about it, we can gain superpowers. And you just described one, being able to be okay feeling misunderstood or rejected. There was a time in my life where I would have felt that was devastating as well. And now I'm more okay with it. So thank you for sharing that, little glimpse into your own process and your journey. I really appreciate it. And I had other questions, of course, to ask you maybe another time. This has been really amazing. And I'm just so grateful for you spending this time with us. And maybe just in closing, if there's anything you feel like either you left out or you want to wrap up with sharing with my audience or whoever finds this video that happens to be watching.
Well, Alicia, I want to say that I've really enjoyed this experience. I mean, it didn't really feel like an interview. It was more like we're just having a really engaging conversation. And, we've covered so much material here that really speaks to like general wisdom and life experience and, autonomy and individuality and, things that are just really important and give a big picture of, how can we don't have to focus on the details of the crisis right now, right? We can just talk about the bigger picture of humanity and how we can rise above. And so it's a real treat to have that opportunity. I just, want to, in a practical way, if people are interested in learning more about what I do, please check out my website. I'm sure you'll put it up. It's andrewkaufmanmd.com. And I do have some, interesting material on my YouTube channel that thank you for linking that. And if you want to, see some of the more scientific aspects about what I've described and some of the conclusions that I've drawn, I think it would be an enriching experience to get an alternate perspective that's not by a designated expert. And, please do make your own opinion and feel free to criticize and comment and, reach out to me. I try my best to correspond with as many people as possible. So, I definitely, if you have something really important that maybe you found out that I made a mistake about something, I'd love to hear about it so that I can, improve going forward. So thanks so much, Alicia.
Yeah, you're welcome. And you are taking consultations, right?
Yes, of course.
There may be people in my audience. I talk to people every day that have mind, body pain and are looking for answers. And I don't ever claim to be the sole answer for anyone. I know there are other people and methods out there that work. And I think people could really benefit from contacting you if they're looking for some one-on-one help right now. So I just thank you so much for your bravery in coming forward and taking the risk to speak to these things. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Of course.